Hello there, guys. Many of you have likely seen this image before. Vienna, 1913 to 1914. Historical records show us that within the Austrian capital city, there were 5 men who would, in wildly different ways, forever change the course of human history. And they all apparently lived, for a short period of time, within just a couple miles of each other. Sigmund Freud, Mustache Man, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, and Archduke Franz Ferdinand. For a few months, these unlikeliest of neighbors could have passed by each other on the street, drank coffee at the same cafe, or shared a mutual friend or two. Maybe, just once, 2 of them both reached for the same apple at the grocery store and got all embarrassed when their hands touched. It is always fascinating and surprising to discover historical figures from such radically different areas of history coexisted directly alongside each other in the most mundane of ways, totally unaware of each other's significance. I wanted to find more examples of this phenomena, and sure enough, I recently stumbled across this image on Twitter that quickly gained a bunch of popularity. It is an aerial photo of the ruins of the ancient city of Ur in modern-day Iraq. 2 buildings are labeled. One belonged to the notoriously shady copper merchant Ea-nasir, known primarily from a surviving cuneiform tablet that was basically the ancient equivalent of a Yelp review, written by a customer angrily complaining of being sold inferior quality copper. The other building apparently belonged to the prophet Abraham, father of questionable parenting and patriarch to the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Apparently these 2 characters lived for a time just down the street from each other, and it got me thinking, is this actually true? Was Ur the Bronze Age equivalent of Vienna? Did these 2 men, who would become famous for completely different reasons thousands of years later, briefly live simply as neighbors to one another? Well, today we will investigate this claim. Were Ea-nasir and Abraham actually neighbors? So to start, we should probably ask ourselves, who were these men, and what was this city claimed to be their shared home? Well, the prophet Abraham probably doesn't need much background. Often hailed as the founder of 3 major religions, a good portion of the human population should be relatively familiar with Abraham and the stories associated with him. Most of our information on Abraham's life comes from the biblical book of Genesis. We are told that in the distant past, a man named Abram was chosen by God and told to settle in the land of Canaan. He forms a covenant with God and changes his name to Abraham, or the father of many nations, in the process. As this name would suggest, he would later go on to father many children, among them being Isaac, ancestor of the Israelites, and Ishmael, ancestor of the Arabs. Among his many claimed descendants are King David, Jesus, and Muhammad, in addition to countless others. Of interest to us, however, is the place of Abraham's birth. The book of Genesis states in a very brief 2 verses that before God spoke to him, Abraham and his family lived in a place called Ur-Kasdim, or anglicized as Ur of the Chaldees. And for centuries, Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike have searched for this Ur-Kasdim, the hometown of Abraham, often to no avail. Now, fast forward to the 1920s. A British archaeologist named Sir Leonard Woolley excavates the ruins of an ancient city in the Iraqi desert at the modern site of Tel Amugaer. His excavations revealed a maze of hundreds of buildings, streets, temples, and tombs. Inscriptions revealed it to be named Ur, though the exact pronunciation is unclear. It was once a powerful Sumerian city, a center of trade and commerce in Mesopotamia during the Bronze Age. One large building, designated by Woolley as Building Number 1, located towards the center of this Ur, and built off of what has been dubbed Old Street, is of interest to us. Scattered throughout the house, the archaeologist uncovered a cache of inscribed clay tablets, one of them being found in the doorway between rooms 2 and 7. Woolley believed room 7 was the kitchen. Frequently written on these tablets was the name of a Sumerian businessman, Ea-nasir, often mentioned alongside complaints about the quality of the copper he apparently trafficked and sold. In all likelihood, this building was likely the residence, and probably also the business front, of this merchant. Ea-nasir probably lived and worked here along with his family, workers, and slaves. The size of his house shows that he was wealthy and successful for his day. Business must have been booming despite the negative reviews. Now, as you may have already noticed, the name of Ea-nasir city, Ur, might raise a few eyebrows, and this definitely wasn't lost on the city's excavator, Leonard Woolley, who rather quickly suspected it was the long sought-after birthplace of Abraham, the Ur-Kasdim, mentioned so briefly in the book of Genesis. And the general consensus among archaeologists today is that Woolley was right. The Sumerian Ur is probably the Ur-Kasdim of the Bible, even if the proof of this is pretty weak, and there are now several rival archaeological sites also fighting for this title. Nonetheless, it seems like our two boys, Ea-nasir and Abraham, may have shared the same hometown after all. But the question of if their houses were close by, and if they even existed at the same time, is a whole nother story. With Ea-nasir, we actually know two rough dates around which he lived in Ur. He is mentioned by name in some clay tablets, which show that he was an active merchant and trader in the 11th and 19th years of the Larsa king Ram-Sin, 1811 and 1803 BC. This would mean that Ea-nasir was likely still operating his copper scam around the same time as when the famous Babylonian conqueror and lawgiver Hammourabi was born, though it is doubtful the two ever met. Unfortunately, we do not know how old Ea-nasir was at this time, nor how long he lived after. One can only hope that the lovable rapscallion lived a long and happy life. Dating the life of Abraham and his possible time in Ur, on the other hand, is much harder for several reasons. For one thing, the book of Genesis never provides a time period for Abraham's life. It is always kept vague and hazy. Unlike Ea-nasir, Genesis never records the name of an individual king or pharaoh for which Abraham is said to have been alive during the reign of, nor does it mention any shared major historical event by which we could correlate his life with other non-biblical sources, namely a battle or the construction of a monument or founding of a city. Instead, most biblical scholars have to use tiny, minute details within the Genesis text itself to create a very shaky timeline or chronology for the stories, precarious as a deck of cards. Typically, they accomplish this by using the genealogy lists the Bible provides. X begat Y, who begat Z, and so on, stacking the generations on top of each other to create a chain, generally using the life of Moses in the Exodus as an anchor point going backwards to Abraham. However, this has its own problems. The dating of Moses' own life is up for debate, and difficult to pin down. This is primarily because the pharaoh in the Exodus is rather unhelpfully left unnamed, so scholars must hotly debate who that pharaoh might have been, and what time period that was, with little agreement or consensus to this day. No fewer than 14 different pharaohs have been proposed, creating wildly different anchor points for these biblical chronologies. The consequence of all this is that the years estimated by biblical scholars for the life and death of Abraham often amount to glorified guesses, with countless competing, sometimes entirely contradictory dates depending on who you ask. At times, you'll even get contradictory dates from the same source. Thanks, Answers in Genesis. You just gave me more questions, not answers. I don't know which one of these two birth dates you gave for Abraham to believe. Okay. Let me step down. Let me calm down a little bit. By comparing dozens of sources, many of them Christian, it seems that generally, Abraham is said to have existed somewhere vaguely between or around 2100 BC and 1750 BC, which equates to sometime during the Middle Bronze Age. Now, you may have noticed that this isn't exactly specific, and you're right. It's like saying, yeah, my great ancestor Jimmy was alive sometime between George Washington and Obama. That doesn't really narrow things down, you know. Also, keep in mind that even this massive range of about 350 years is debated, and some scholars have proposed Abraham existing as recently as 700 BC in the Iron Age, or as distantly as 2900 BC in the early Bronze Age. Now, this huge and hazy span of time in which Abraham could have existed does overlap with the life of Ea-nasir in the final years of the 19th century BC. But then again, with an estimate that wide, this doesn't really mean much. Depending on which dates you favor, Abraham could either have been 1,000 years dead by that time, or 1,000 years in the future. We're talking vast periods of time in which whole empires rose and fell, during which Abraham may or may not have been alive. And on another level, it's even more complicated than that. The reliability of Genesis itself as a historical source is contested. Details in it contradict other historical sources and archaeological evidence. Abraham is a legendary figure. Unlike Ea-nasir, we do not have any contemporary documents mentioning his name until long after he is said to have lived. The book of Genesis, according to most scholars, wasn't composed until around 500 BC, meaning much like the Iliad or the Odyssey, the stories in it must have circulated orally, by word of mouth, generation after generation, for over 1,000 years before they were properly written down. This has led many historians to question if Abraham existed at all. His nebulous time period and the lack of archaeological evidence to support his existence puts him on the level of King Arthur, Orpheus, Oedipus, or Achilles, figures closer in the realm of legend than of history. Did a real historical man named Abraham actually exist, live and grow up in the Sumerian city of Ur? We don't know, and likely can never know. This is a person that would have existed so far in the past, and left such little trace that it is difficult to discuss anything about his life with much certainty. It certainly isn't impossible that he existed, it's just hard to say. We just don't have the facts or data. But what about the supposed house of Abraham in Ur, just down the street from Ea-nasir's? Well, I hate to break it to you, but that's not Abraham's house. It's just called that because of tourism. That's a modern name tacked onto it for basically, no reason? Probably stemming from Sir Leonard Woolley's nickname for this quarter of the city during his excavations in the 1920s. He labeled this area AH, or Abraham's Housing. It was just a nickname he made up, in the same way Woolley made up all the street names and the housing numbers in his maps. It was just a way to label things, and he just was like, yeah, I'll call it Abraham's Housing, why not? The building in question, heavily reconstructed in the 1980s, is roughly dated to 1800 BC, to the time of Ea-nasir. But crucially, it wasn't a place of residence. It was an administrative center, a public government building. Calling it Abraham's house was basically just an excuse to drum up tourism, because it roughly doing a lot of legwork here, dates to around the time Abraham may have existed, which, as we have already seen, isn't exactly precise. You might as well pick any random building in the entire city of Ur and say it's Abraham's, and it would be about as accurate a statement, if not more. So, in conclusion, were Ea-nasir and Abraham neighbors? Well, maybe. I do think it is possible, and let me be careful here, that the prophet and the copper trader could have met and been neighbors, but there's a lot of qualifiers to that statement. First of all, it depends on if the Ur of archaeology was in fact the same place as the Ur Kasdim of the Bible. Second, it depends on when exactly Abraham lived, if he lived at all. To meet Ea-nasir, he would need to have lived in Ur sometime around 1800 BC. And lastly, no, this particular building, despite its name, wasn't Abraham's. If Abraham did in fact live in Ur around the same time as Ea-nasir, he must have lived somewhere else. So, take your pick. But yes, it certainly is possible. Probable? But possible, yes, in light of the very hazy and poor historical record we have for both of these figures. The two could have met. And if they ever actually did, both of them probably could never have imagined that people would be talking about and debating the possibility of that encounter almost 4,000 years later. Ea-nasir and Abraham meeting on the streets of Ur. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.